Okay, recording is in progress. We're going to get started. Topic today is identifying the right surgeons. I believe that these are something that is common for everyone, and you have had the opportunities to either learn it or either heard about it. If in any case you have never heard the concept of burden, it's okay as well because it's going to start very fundamental. We're going to start with very basic questions regarding the burden. So that's totally okay. But I'd like to make sure that this session can be as interactive as possible. If in any chances that you have any questions throughout the session, jadi kalau ada pertanyaan aku langsung drop aja in the chat box. I'm going to mix my language just to make sure that this can be as accessible as possible. And it's just a lot better with things in both languages in English. So I'm going to just like mix it throughout the system. Now, Ariel has introduced me, but I'd like to just like reintroduce myself a little bit. There's like a few things and list of things that I have over participated on and have the opportunity to contribute to. But most importantly, currently my institution is UNPI or Film Indonesia University, and you can just call me Jess. The most important and notable experience of all is obviously the experience I had to participate in the first and second edition of IWGM 2024 and 2025, and to cap one of the edition, which is the third edition of IWGM, which is last year as well, on the second semester. These are like the most notable things that I'm very proud of and I'd like to always talk about whenever I now. Before we move on, I'd like to give one disclaimer that most motions used in this session would be taken from ALSA EE 2026, which I also have the opportunity to cap. So credit to all my other fellow CAT that also helped in the process of creating the motion. The second reason as to why then I would like to use ALSA EE motions because we have a lot of selections of WGM related topic. So I think that would be something that everybody might want to discuss or like if you do not have the opportunity to. In any chances that you might see the tabs like you participated in the competition. So I hope that if you have any questions regarding to the motions as well, you can just directly ask in the chat box. Okay. Now we're going to go with the first part, which is burdens. I would like to identify first the concept of burdens, like the understanding of before I move on, I'd like to ask, is there anyone in here that wants to volunteer themselves and answer the question, what do you know about business? Anyone? Is there any? I will pick from the list if there's nobody that they can. Just to make sure that there is contribution coming from participants. How about Shakira? Do you want to share who's that? About what's the new birthday? Shakira, are you here? Shakira, are you here? Maybe Shakira
Oh,
is
sorry, I can't clearly hear you. I think your voice is a little bit too low. Can you repeat the question?
Okay. The question is, what do you know about burgers?
I think burden is the questions that you need to answer throughout the debate. So that's why it is usually imposed in the motions, or there is a burden that you put onto the motions according to your cases. So burdens is just questions that you need to prove, basically.
Thank you so much, Shafira. And it's correct because the concept of burdens is actually very simple, which is that what you need to prove in the debate, right? So burdens is whatever it is that you need to prove. And as Shafira has mentioned, it is usually either implied in the motion side or it is implied by the speaker, which like it promises us with certain type of checklist of questions that you say that you will answer. But I'd like to divide it into two parts, which is the to understand the bigger picture, which it is not yet revised, but this is not just macro. I'm just using the term to picturize that there is some major macro burdens that usually exist in a debate, which become the main identity and goal. Usually, this is like your biggest contribution. What is it exactly that you're promising the judges? There's this things called micro, which is like more minor that exists in every part of your speech that accompany the macro burden. Jadi, the macro burden is the overall great things that you promise the judge will happen at the end of your speech. And the micro is the things that you use as a method to answer that macro burden, right? So each statement asserted in the debate is slow burden. So in order for you to be able to picturize the concept of burden, do not see it as something that only done once in a debate. So you don't do it once at the beginning of your speech. You constantly do it throughout your speech. You constantly do it throughout the three speaker speeches, let's say in AP style. So this is not something that you only assert at once. So when you think of burdens, think about how many has you contributed and how many has you answered within your entire speech and your entire team contribution. So that's the first thing, understanding the concept. Now, what you need to prove in the debate, this is the revised version. So sorry, this is the revised. So it should be main, major, macro assumptions and micro or minor assumptions. Yeah. The tadi is like the previous version before the revision. So this is the same. Now, the next things I would like to directly focus is that I think that it's a bit hard to be able to just understand it theoretically. So I just want to jump straight into giving an example. How does this concept even look like in actual case selection? So this is a sample mention from also correctly, which is this how supports the portrayal of women as central, supernatural, and system of influence. So this is the now, picturization of macro and micro would look like this. You can take a look at the macro one. In this specific mission, most likely what you would do is that you're going to try to prove that the portrayal has benefit. The specific community we think is a factor, right? Because this is a support base, you're probably going to say that there will be a benefit and there will be a positive impact out of like having this portrayal. And you would probably say that the benefit might benefit this specific community, let's say women. Or let's say that you're trying to prove that there is a positive output from supporting the portrayal overall, regardless of like, which community that is going to be affected. Or you would like to wait on how then the portrayal are able to resolve the current tension, which is like any existing problem or any existing harms to identify status and hence validating the support, right? So these are macro because these are like the biggest contribution you would like to push within the debate. But things that are more micro going to look like into ways of improving the macro assumptions. For example, in proving that there will be a benefit of the portrayal to a specific type of community, you probably will attempt to describe the form of portrayal in status quo first. That will result into a burden of whether or not that the description is true, whether or not that the description is enough, right? So that's an additional follow-up burden that exists because of a earlier assumption that you are trying to do in the debate. Or you're trying to attempt to relate the portrayal in fact what the audiences that are watching or like that are consuming the media. Or even more specific, sometimes we would like to divide the burdens that are much more smaller, which we talk about like the burdens to a women or like the burdens to a general audience. So that's the example of how it's like the micro or more minor burdens look like. So as you can see already, the entire concept of burdens are very integrated. So it's not separated. It's something that is continuously happening within the group, right? So during the very first assumption that you have, which is the macro assumption, to the end, every little detail of assumption you have, everything needs to be connected to answer these specific macro burdens, but also everything would also have consequences as a speaker. So that's like the picturization I would like everyone to understand. Now, that sounds like a lot of work to do, and that sounds like too complex. Meanwhile, in debate, you don't really have a lot of time. So you only have, let's at best, 15 minutes in VP, and you only have 30 minutes in, let's say, Asian parliamentary style. How does this work then? This usually works into not in practice. This works as a general understanding that is manifested through practice. So you could be able to have quicker thinking. You could be able to have a quicker strategy, or you could be able to develop certain type of structure that allow you to execute or like identify the burden. We'll get there later, how to be able to strategize the burden during this building. But overall, these are something that you don't do immediately during this building, but these are like contribution throughout the training session. So understand that while it sounds complex because it is not a problem that you have or like you need to resolve within a day. These are something that you need to resolve up your journey as a leader. So that's like the first perception that I'd like everyone to also take because it's not something that is easy especially because you need to develop sense of understanding what which burdens that is more strategic, which burdens that is more correct, which what we are going to do to actually. So that's on the general concept to first. Next. Now, I want to pilot as well. What is judge think of burdens? Because I assume that a lot of the participants here might be debaters, are preparing for competition or debaters themselves. But I do take a look at the names and I see that there are some judges or like some people that are applying as a judge in general competition. I do not know if you apply as a judge in IWGM, but this is the three assumptions that judge has when it comes to a burden because we do have opinion regarding burdens. The first thing is that judge is most likely going to be cyclical of your burden. So it is not enough again to assert it in the beginning of your speech. You need to consistently try to prove to the judge that this burden not only is proven, but it is the most correct burden that you are identifying within the debate. But also, the second thing that judge probably going to assume is that they might not be able to assume which is your burden. And this is also why it's an important thing for debaters to help the judge understand what is the scope of your burdens as well. Now, the reason why that this is also crucial because within the debate, you are not debating in vacuum, right? You have your opponent will make it their job to mislead or like to be able to kind of refute or to kind of reframe what type of burden that you have. And this is an often used strategy by people within a debate as opposition, which to either clarify that their government are picking the wrong burden or their opponent in general are picking the wrong burden or their burden are unstrategically answered. So it become an important part of your job as a debater to actually try to clarify to what's your burden in a more explicit manner, but not only that, but to also justify why that should be your burden, which so overall help to kind of validate that. But obviously, this doesn't mean that you always have to explicitly mention that, oh, this is our burden. We think that this is correct because of ABC. But this is like through an implicit effort to actually explaining that a certain type of contribution is there or certain type of contribution is actually relevant. So it doesn't have to be as explicit as that. Even an effort that is implicit will help you because judges will be able to also notice that that is a contribution that is justified, that is a contribution that is indeed relevant. So that's the second one. The third thing that you would probably would like to know with judge assumptions is that they are going to actively compare your burden. So again, because you don't have this burden in a vacuum, you're probably going to have judge to either reflect your burden that you have chosen to the motions because the motion affect the overall direction of burden, especially the type of motion, and also to your own contribution. Is that reflected? Is it answered? Or to your opponent's contribution, right? So your burden will actively be compared to your opponent's burden as well in a way that whether or not that they answer the burden better than you, if they pick the burden better than you. So these are like an important thing for you to know. So these are like things that your judge think about your burden and what they assume regarding burdens in general. And understanding and knowing this as a debater matter because it allows you to be able to understand how judge perceive certain type of case and how judge perceive certain type of burden in a debate. Yeah, maybe that's like the purpose of most sources. Now that you put judge thing of it, then you need to be able to understand itself. And at the end of the day, in order for you to fulfill all those perceptions from judges, you require effort, right? It's constant effort. This is constant effort. You did not write the constant, so sorry about that. But the most important thing is that you need to be consistent. You need to ensure that it is answered. Consistency means that you practice it. You constantly try to do better in identifying the burden. So it requires multiple practices, multiple feedback, and you need to answer that it is answered in a way that you need to be able to reflect what is your burden, awareness of that first, and then after that, have you answered your burden? And then effort to be able to fix it, consistent effort to be able to make it better. Now, I understand that there might not be, not everybody has coaches, and that's okay because the purpose of like going to a lot of competitions is actually also, or sparring session, doesn't have to be competition, is actually to shape and sharpen your ability to have better sensibility and learning because you need to be able to check it with other people. So in a competition, let's say in certain round, you can ask the questions like, have I identified the correct questions or have I identified the correct and strategic burdens. Those are like the kind of specific questions you definitely can ask the judge. Or in a sparring session, if you don't have a judge, you can ask your other friend or you can ask your opponent, what do you think about my burden and what do you think about my overall contribution? So those are like the alternative thing that you can do. But I think that having the community like IWGM is important and good because then in community section, I believe that any time of the year, if you have questions, you can just drop it. Guys, I have this motion and I think that these are the burdens I'd like to identify. Is there anyone in here that can give their opinion if this is the correct burden or not? I think that that's the function and overall importance of having a community and belief result. So that's definitely something that you can do and don't be shy to do it. I believe that anybody in the group would be glad to help regardless of like who they are. So that's another thing at the end of the day. Yeah. Now let's go to the specific first. I understand that this is a things that probably everybody has gone through multiple times, but I will never be tired to re-explain again and again to what does motion type effective burden look like. So we are going to take a look with it toward an existing motions. You just make sure that it's not a repetition to any existing seminar that you have ever seen or guide that you have ever seen. So I try to simplify it as simple as possible to make it a lot more understandable. In any cases that you have questions, just drop. So let's understand first what does motion path has to do with burdens. Because in the macro burdens and because during case building and execution of case, you're going to answer the most important questions within a certain type of motion. It is important for you to be able to understand first, like what is the motion even about? So that's why motion type matter because motion type has a direct correlation to what type of burdens you're probably going to have, you're not going to have, and you might want to have. So not mandatory, but it's a nice thing to have. And we're going to get there during this half week that we have. So let's go with the first one, which is policy, right? It's a policy type of motion, which is divided usually in hard policy like this health food and a more soft policy like this health food that action one. Usually the most important burden is to be able to create a sense of policy. And this sense of policy doesn't exist just because. The logical reasoning as to why the policy debate require quote unquote policy, I know that it's counterintuitive. It's because the most important essence of it is an identification of a problem that usually require the solution or resolution through a more concrete method of solution. So there is an expectation of having a concrete step to be able to resolve toward a certain type of problem, and that's why it is called policy. And that is why in general, in a policy debate, you are acting as state. Jadi biasanya kita bertindak sebagai pemerintah, we take the role of a state because state have the capacity to assume a more concrete solution. And that's why in international IR, the RDs house would you act as an international body because you have the capacity to be able to enact certain type of concrete solution. Now, in these circumstances, then most of the time, I think that one of the burden that people fail to be able to identify is to be able to go from what does policy even look like and how should you set up your policy in order to fulfill that specific burden of practicality, right? Because sometimes when we think of like this house word, we think of like how can we resolve the problem through a more concrete and practical manner, and how can we get towards a much more better identified step by step in order for us to create that sense. The example that I have in here is on this mission, which is this also grant legal amnesty to radical feminist activists that target the dismantling of manosphere communities and infrastructure. A little bit of context, just to, in any case that there are people that are not familiar with the concept, granting legal amnesty here means that you're going to provide condition where you protect them whenever that there is a cases of like radical action that violates certain type of law. So they would be excuses or they would have their punishment reduced. That's usually what the concept of legal amnesty looks like. And this is usually the kind of concept that we gave to a kind of group that we believe is a protectable by certain type of justification. Oftentimes we use it in, let's say, quote unquote, radical political activists in countries where like there are a lot of tension among the majority and minorities. Usually the state will pardon them and provide these people to kind of like prevent further tension. when we are consistently enacting a more punitive framework. So this is like the logical understanding towards what an legal community works. And the concept of manosphere in itself is the general concept where there is an increased rising, uh, action taken by usually incel or usually taken by people that are quote unquote male activists that believe that feminism is out to get. So there is an increased number of sexual harassment cases. There is an increased number of harassment in general towards gender minority. And this is like the action that we must take. So there are two important concepts, which the brand legal honesty, the stakeholder within the radical feminists, and also the resistance of dismantling of manosphere or manosphere in general. Now, so before I move on and identify the burden, I'd like to ask, is there anyone that want to try to identify the burden that you see? Can this silakan nanti kita now start calling me here. I would like to know what Cecilia is thinking. What do you think? I was here, Cecilia. Cecilia Amalie. Yeah. No, maybe Irene with double E.
Um, maybe one of the burdens if the legal amnesty would promote radical feminist like movement, like it would be successful.
How do you define it?
Oh, like if it would further promote the movement that the radical feminist is trying to use.
So promotion of the movement, yeah? That's the goal. Okay. Now, that is what we call as goal, right? What you are like to do by granting legal amnesty is to be able to help feminists to be promoted. That is what is considered as goal. There will be more on this later during the session of like how many mistakes that we do when we are identifying burdens. But the general assumption is that I believe that while that this can be relevant, when we try to identify the burden immediately toward an output, there will be a question of relevance, especially toward why is it exactly that promotion is the most direct output that comes from granting legal amnesty. Jadi kayak, it's not that it's wrong, it can be correct, it's just that it requires further steps to be able to answer it. So definitely a good impact. It's just that it requires more assessment for how then we get there. Now, an example of burden that might come out of this motion is as simple as this question, which like, how would granting legal amnesty help radical families? Like that can be a question, right? Or like, what is the justification of providing legal amnesty to radical feminists in this context? That's the second type of question. Or like, why would radical feminists require legal amnesty in this specific context? Or like, what is the interest of state in providing legal amnesty to radical feminists in this context? So notice that most of the time, the more macro burden and the more bigger burden starts with a question that directly reflect the motion. It comes from the motion. It doesn't come from anywhere. It's just the way that we are reading motion. So how would you grant the legal amnesty? Why would you grant the legal amnesty? Like how does providing the legal amnesty create anything at all for these specific stakeholders? So when it comes to burden in motion like this, it's like it's important to go from the notions, obviously, but also it's important to be able to understand then because we're going to grant a legal amnesty, how would you create that legal amnesty or how would you provide that legal amnesty? This is like what we commonly understand as legal. So because we're creating policy, our burdens would most of the time correlate with the aspect of forming setup. Jadi kayak setupnya akan seperti apa? That's an inevitable burdens that come. These are like the kind of burdens that come because if you are going to make policy, you don't have the specific method on how would that policy look like, then it become a question, how would that manifestation even happen, right? So that's a logical change. Why does setup become, or like policy, or like mechanism become an important aspect of this health today? Now, in this case, then, we would probably try to explain the description of legal amnesty. We're probably going to talk about the extent, where it is applied, or what is the product of the legal amnesty. These like questions that are probably going to manifest whenever that you are debating this specific type of motion, and whenever that you would like to be able to create an idea of, let's say, justifying the amnesty to begin with. Now, obviously, these are just a set list of questions. There is no such thing as like these are like the correct number of questions, or these are like the correct number of descriptions. That depend on like how far do you think you have to feel relevant, obviously. But this is just an example of what I believe might be complete during my case building. I'll probably try to identify first what does the variable even is. Jadi start with variable dulu. Variable ini apa ya? Description. And then I'm going to think about, is there any limitation of where and how this variable is applied if I'm making a policy or like making a mechanism? In this case, will I grant legal amnesty to a full extent, berarti no punishment at all, or can reduction of punishment? Or let's say it's not the amount of punishment, maybe it's about like the cases, like the targeted dismantling format that they are doing, or radical action that they are doing. So, is there any limitation of radicality that I will grant the legal amnesty processing? So, those questions. Can you have both? Yes, you can have both. Obviously, you can. You can try to make sure that your setup is as complete as possible. But eventually, it's important for us to be able to identify this set of questions in order to make sure that the policy and the mechanism that we're promising in the debate are able to be manifested. Jadi kayak that's like the logical thing. By the way, can you guys hear the music in the background before I move on? Is it audible? No? No issue? Oh, okay. Aman ya? Okay, thank you. Oh, okay. So currently there is like music in the background. I hope it doesn't bother the session. But in any case, do let me as on clear. So that's in policy. So policy debate usually kind of add the sort of an expectation for the debaters to kind of create a set of policy or a set of mechanism that accompany the policy that you promise on in the debate. And that also means that you need to be able to talk about toward why then these are the policy that you would like to have, and why then these are the mechanism that you would like to have in order for that to become much more compelling. And that's why sometimes in this house of debate, you will hear judges saying that, oh, but you don't talk about the status quo though. You haven't answered why then that policy works more. Your opposition talk about status quo. They tell me that there is an alternative. So that's why it's tough. Because when you want to implement something new within a debate, there will be an automatic discussion of like, why do you want to create something new? Is there a problem with the previous solution? So that's the logical change as to why don't we need to question kenapa harus buat baru, right? What happened to the previous one? So it's something that you might want to delve into as an additional burden whenever that you debate that. So there is no such thing as automatic loss, but like it would be nice for you to have. Like this is why I say that in specific type of mission, it would be really, really nice if the debater are trying to address or like identify specific problem like that. Like what is this happening? Why the fail? For example, right? So that's all we have with on mutual time on policy. This is believe that action why works actually different. It's a way that well that if this a policy you might not take the after that you could not take the state perspective because you are acting as a third person self, like also let's see that or evaluating the specific type of action that the actor would take should take within it, and that is what you recognize. And when you see it some mechanism out like this is about this helps that that's that this helps mean that Indonesia should grant grant tax, then we would have to be able to identify how would Indonesia specifically address this and how would that, and how would that correlate what the impact or like benefit process that out of country bring the taxes. So that's an example If it's a bit how to act shit. And if you would have after, I said you will go to evaluate, but I could get this up. Can you what it's hard policy. Well, that people it that what commonly probably not active being or either soft policy or hard policy, and that's why I thought. Now, obviously, the parents that you might want to identify children and experience of activity. It would be helpful where that's get wrong. Because what we understand about factor is that it usually limits what that said. So the action. So if what I mean not wrong, what's that? There are people who mentioned what you're able like that. So let's say in the one that's yes, yeah, might be able to switch. Let me change my second. That's all maybe so. After it's like fun. Simple. 5 minutes of doing that. The goal come from here. Audible ya? So you can hear me just fine. Okay. Okay. Just okay, thank you. You just set the video dulu. Hmm. Let's continue. So that's the rationalization on after and the dimensions that you could be able to exploit out of after motion usually did not just come from like the direct characterization out of it. Let's say that what you understand is that feminists want equality, but it comes from multiple factors, which that you can try to understand the motive. Like what is the motive of peer movement? Let's say that yeah, feminists want equality, but why do they want equality? Right? Understanding that specific concept allow you to have a much more concrete and better understanding toward why the actor want to do certain things or context of circumstances. So we understand that feminists want equality. We know the motive why they want equality, but like, do we understand the context of circumstances that created that motive? Or do we understand the difference in context of circumstances when they want that motive and when they what they have now? So that comparison matter because then we could be able to compare those type of understanding if the motive is still valid, if the motive is still the same by understanding the whole circumstances, the way that it changes and the trend that it is. Or let's say the benefit that they get out of it. And benefit can be direct and indirect. Direct as in that what do these specific stakeholder get directly out of an action? And indirect as in what do they get if certain other stakeholder get that benefit? So for example, in a debate about movement, you might want to directly say that feminists get A, B, C, D. You might want to talk about what women have and get out of like the specific action that they get. And that in itself is a fulfillment to the stakeholder. Why? So that's why it's the jump of logic that you could be able to have when you are identifying benefit. And the same with harms, right? So benefit harms, like they have the same type of flow of thoughts. Principle also matter. For example, you understand the context of circumstance of benefit. What is the value that these specific stakeholder have? What is their vision? So that's an important aspect as well. Now, do you need to have all in an actor? You don't have to have all. Most of the time, you need to select several or you need to select only one. But having understanding of that wide array of understanding on an actor definitely help. So how does this help a train? This help a training because you could be able whenever you look up stakeholder, if you're doing mentoring over circumstance, right? Do you understand their motive? Do you understand the context of circumstances that they're on? Do you understand the benefit that they get out of like certain type of action? And a lot of long list of actions. So these are like important things when you want to do mentoring specifically when you want to identify what specific things that you need to understand of an actor. And the other things that a lot of people forget is the first part because active debate do not exist on its own. It exists accompanied by as a type of motion. Let's say that actor debate plus policy or actor debate plus, let's say, regret. So if that is the case, then you still have to be able to fulfill the additional type of expectation that come out of that purpose, right? So the example of this is there. First of all, is on the South belief that feminist movement in the global South should prioritize human form over social and structural growth. So in here, you are talking about South actors, which that you are talking about feminist movement in global South. So you need to be able to understand what this specific stakeholder should do this, for example. Now, how would you identify the should then? Karena should itu kan kayak need to also be identified. Like, why do you think that they should do that? It can be out of kayak principle, it can be out of benefit for them, or it can also be a benefit to other people, and that's why they need to do this because they can do this, or they are responsible towards the circumstances. That's why they should do this. So there are multiple layer and faceted idea toward why then certain actors should do certain things, but it derives from your understanding of the stakeholder as or in a debate of like as feminist movement in global south saying this house would prioritize these are probably much more direct and hard actually usually because you are directly speaking as the stakeholder. Meanwhile, the other one you are evaluates the position of the stakeholder and what they need to do. So that's like the major differences. But nonetheless, regardless of these differences, the understanding of the actual interest matter because of the specific reasons tadi yang udah dibahas. Kenapa pada akhirnya we still need to understand the interest of the actor. Okay, so this is an example of the previous motion. So if the motion is as what is said, and we want to be able to build a relevancy around the description of feminist movement in itself, you probably going to indicate kayak kalau tentang should-nya adalah apakah it can be related to the benefit either, or like they should do this because there is a greater stakeholder to care for, let's say vulnerable women, or moral principle on whether or not certain action is correct for them. Jadi kayak it's not always just practical. It can also be philosophical and evaluated kayak moral principle whether or not they need to be the cause of a certain type of movement. Tapi you need to format the should. So you cannot just leave that alone. You need to be able to interpret what does the should mean. So that's like an understanding variable and how motion type dictate specific decision in a so So far we understand that. Jadi kayak motion type most of the time results into a dictation or like expectation to how should you interpret specific type of additional burden or like general burden that you have in certain type of motions. Itu untuk motions. Now, I'd like to highlight one motion. This is a bit different. Sometimes you don't debate as actor that can create concrete action. Like, for example, in the motion of this house as trans feminist movement, we would actively push for broader abolishment of gender status, or in a debate of as progressive individuals living in developing states, this would conform to society. The similarity between these two motions is that the actors are probably vulnerable enough that they are unable to make such a massive, fancy, concrete act. In debate about vulnerable stakeholders, usually there is a limitation to how far their activism can look like. Or in a debate about individual, usually there is this confusion to how the policy should look like. So in an actor first policy debate, if there is this limitation that you are facing and sometimes it's a bit hard for you, just understand that this doesn't mean you don't visualize the way that you would. It just probably means you don't have to create such a fun setting that a state or international organization or a more concrete organized organization capable to do. What is the example? The example in a motion number one, as trans feminist movement, when you actively want to push for this, you still need to visualize how would you actively push for the broader abolishment. For example, as simple as mentioning that we're going to campaign for it, or as simple as saying that we are going to ensure that there would be majority general understanding between our members to be able to prioritize certain type of demand, or we are going to make sure that we're going to actively and politically select the kind of political leader that are going to align to that value more, as small as it is. For example, that's what you're going to do. Or as a progressive individual, in this specific debate, what I like to do is to conceptualize choice. Karena debat kita tentang choice, you make the decision to do something, to conform, to pick A, for example, or sometimes comparative, pick A over B. And in that specific type of debate, what I like to visualize is that how's the decision-making process usually look like. So, as a progressive individual, in these circumstances, biasanya harus you assess your decision. Let's say that you assess as a progressive individual living in a developing case, you probably are going to be in constant dilemmatic situation where you are, let's say, judged or like discouraged or let's say invalidated. And in that circumstances, why does this decision make sense? So what would you do to conform, right? So that's a justification. But what would you do exactly to conform? That can also visualize it to the debaters and judges that oh ini bentuk conformnya, oh manifestationnya kayak gitu karena bentuknya kayak gini. Jadi kayak that's the logical thing would widen your argument juga bisa jadi more strong or like more concrete if there is understanding and visualization tentang kayak mechanism skill apapun looks like that. So that's on mission time. Now I have been talking a lot, so I would like to hear more thoughts from let's say the participants. So far, is there any questions daripada yang dijawabnya? I'd like to the questions before we move to evaluation motions. Any questions? Apakah shuffle berarti tidak ada atau ada? No questions ya? Itu. Okay. So if there is a question so far, let's move on. Now, evaluation today. The first one is result based. Now, in general sense, this is one of the most difficult things because what you need to do is usually evaluating the good and bad, right? That's like the easiest understanding of what this is. But just how in policy debate it helps to have that mechanism. It also helps to have parameters within our setup. And what we are parametering to the time as the variable. Let's say that if it is this house believe that A is in interest of B, or this house believe that X is more harmful, X provide more harm than benefit. Those sort of debate usually would be a lot better, or like would be able to be understood a lot better by the judge if there are a set of parameters. in understanding how do you perceive ignorance? How do you perceive, let's say, harms versus benefits? And the example of the emotion is this, which is what paganism. Just to kind of summarize the context, like paganism is a spiritual belief that exists in a polytheistic religion, and it exists in Greek, Egyptian, Roman. Jadi kayak the easiest example is a witch, right? Jadi kayak usually a witch society come from pagan culture, and tarot reading, for example, that come from pagan culture. So the debate on like how commercialization of paganism brings more harm than good usually can be understood a lot better if we understand first how do you define harm, right? So a lot of the time, what we are missing is the definition of harm. What do we understand about harm? So a lot of debaters like to directly judge if this is bad because of A. We don't actually try to take a step back and try to think. Do you think that A is the only harm? Do you think A is one of the most important harm? Because the struggle of this debate, everything can be a relevant burden as long as they are harmful and beneficial. And still, sometimes there are multiple aspects and dimensions that can allow you as opening or closing to kind of like be less strategic or more strategic than another. And that's why it's important to be able to conceptualize it through. Jadi kayak, how do you perceive harm? Or even if it is something DP contact, it is always helpful because it kind of helps you to not directly think of one harm. It helps you to create a set of parameters of multiple harms that make your idea of harm a lot more complex than what you might initially believe on. Jadi kayak gitu. Jadi kayak how can you elevate the concept of harm and how can you make harm to be something that are much more complex than what is understood can be done through understanding the concept of parameter. Contohnya kayak gitu. Jadi the example would look like this. Oh, okay. So the example are deleted, but the example of this would look like, for example, in understanding the concept of harm, we are probably going to identify kayak misalnya, okay, the way that we set the parameter of harm adalah the way that these reflect internally toward the concept of paganism. Jadi kayak the prime minister in government want to be able to directly talk about and evaluate the harm toward paganism as a concept, certain religion. So then you might come to the questions of like why do these generally generate harm, but also the minor burden that might appear out of it is a description of like, oh ya udah kayak kalau it is going to be harmful toward the paganism, then you need to understand dulu what is paganism, what value do they have, how does commercialization create this specific type of harm. I believe that later on I would have this example as well because I'm using this in giving an example on how to create the burden. But that's an example early on in the session. Yeah? Jadi kayak that's what you can do in conceptualizing and parameter, creating parameter out of like harm concept specifically. Okay. Start, which is evaluated on the self-support or the self-process. These are like very often happen in debate and exist in a way, but I think that one of the things that's kind of missing is the description of the variable. Again, same. Karena it is a lot easy for us to directly jump to benefit and harm before understanding the description of variable dulu, which is why it's important to identify how does the variable look like in such a way. So if you support A, describe first how does A look like. If you oppose A, talk about how does A look like as well. So before you assess the aspect of good, the aspect of bad for the variable, you need to know how does the variable look like now. So not imaginary, karena status we are debating on status quo. So really to be able to picturize it in the way that it looks like now, and then you can be able to talk about how does supporting or opposing look. What is the reasoning behind supporting or opposing? How does that manifesting into that benefit or harm that we are talking about? So that's an example. Okay. Now another example look like into distribution. Let's say that in a debate of the South supports Australia's U16 social media ban. You don't directly jump to talk about that the support is good because it protects children. You will talk about first, right? About how does the Australia's U16 social media ban look like right now. So that's to describe and to allow better understanding to what kenapa then your benefit later makes sense. Jadi kayak that's why description on things like this matter a lot of the time because it allows you to be able to directly connect them to what this is why this is our practical impact or this is why this is our benefit at the end of the day. In the same way, in the motion of this also poses the imposed expectation of self-sacrifice in religious followers. You won't immediately say that, oh, we oppose this because it's kind of like create a set of unrealistic expectations that are harmful toward the religious follower that make their life more restrictive and make them a lot unhappier. Like you don't directly go to that, you probably will talk first. How does this imposed expectation usually look like? And therefore, that specific harm makes sense within the debate, right? Jadi that's the example, yeah, on like what you can do when you're evaluating in this house of polls and this house of polls. Last point, which is this house regret and this house prefers will X over Y. Now, these solutions is a bit tricky because they have specific set of expectations that are a lot different than others. But the most important is that they actually share principal similarity. The principal similarity is that both motion want to be able to talk in retrospective, meaning that there is a certain type of things that you wish were different, right? The difference is that in this regret, the contributor to harm is the variable in the motion. And the thing that without the variable in the motion, this harm will never exist, and hence the benefit is exists instead. And that's what we mean as counterfactual, which like what is the other fact that will happen if this motion never exists, if the specific threat never exists, if the narrative never exists. So that's an example. This was regrets. But in this paper, it's on contrary because you believe that there might be better things that happen if this specific variable implements within the world. So the variable did not exist yet. In this house regard, the variable exists. So that's like the differences with chicken and egg with this house regrets and this house prefers. Tapi kayak di end of the day fundamentally sama. They would like to have a different world. You wish to be able to have a different things than now. That's like the similarity between emotions. Now, the world building in the South Reapers world and in the counterfactual of the South that are never appear. So you don't assume that it's automatically true. So in debate, when you want to say that this is the counterfactual, it is important to actually explain what is the reasoning behind that piece. Jadi kayak if you believe that in the South regret commercialization of extraterrestrial resources, let's say that without you believe that the commercialization of extraterrestrial resources has created unreasonable amount of investment of, let's say, investment out of our current resources of humanity to this specific project, whereas that it could be able to be diverted to fixing the earth. Let's say that that's the harm that you would like to talk about. And in the counterfactual, you believe that we would have a much more focused resources to fixing Earth. You need to explain why is that case. Why, without the existence of commercialization, the ultimate response from human is to let's put the benefit of like the resources we have to fix the Earth. Jadi kayak that's the kind of thing that you have to rationalize. In the same way, that the debate tentang South for a world where the Indian subcontinent become a united federal state over a world where it was partitioned provinces of India and Pakistan. A lot of context like I did not include it because I like to just like dissect the logic behind what question to identify. Balik lagi di debat ini, ya berarti you need to be able to imagine kalau misalnya the partition never happened and what happened adalah we are going to create a federal state of Indian subcontinent, what would most likely be the case? Let's say you would say that Indian will be less divided, where that there will be less tension between the Muslim and Hindustan. Like that's your assumption. But you need to be able to explain then what would that be the case? Like opposition have a fair game to assume that no, they are going to still have a clash, they will still have tension because inherently their issue are, let's say, fundamentally derived from their differences. So that's a fair assumption. But that is exactly why in this specific type of debate, you might want to be able to explain why if there is a reimagined version of Indian subcontinent, there will be a differences either in the approach of the state toward the people, in approach from the people toward each other. Like how would that look like? So that's an example, yeah, toward how can you identify that specific type of differences and also how can you justify that differences and why it matter and it is not a form of yet in that way. Okay, that's on this also graph and this also prefer world x over y. Okay, let's go with common difficulties first. Now, I'd like to go with the common difficulties because I think that After understanding the common difficulties, the step-by-step will make more sense. But before I go with the common difficulties, I would like to encourage everyone, if you have any difficulties in identifying burden, drop them now. Because the common difficulties that I set in here are just on what I heard from my coaching, for example, or from friends or from other debaters. Or let's say what I have ever experienced as like a younger debater. Jadi kayak if you have any difficulty, drop them now. We're going to talk over it. Oke, jadi kayak langsung tulis aja in chat box. Okay. Anytime, I'm going to drink dulu. Sorry. Oke, bentar, let me check. There might be an important lagi. Oh, okay. Okay, now we're going to just continue. Okay. Okay, first difficulty. I have a hard time in identifying the correct word. Now, why and what causes? Let's understand this. Kenapa kadang susah untuk bisa find the correct burden? Biasanya kita susah find the correct burden karena satu, finding correct burden become hard since the case building session. Jadi kayak you just cannot find it. Like this is the definition of hard in this case. Or like sometimes hard in identifying itu bukan kayak susah nyari, tapi lebih ke mutusin. Kayak I have a lot of burdens, I don't know which to pick. Right? That can be it. Biasanya it caused by what? It usually caused by, first of all, of course, lack of understanding in emotion part. That's the first thing. The second thing adalah lack of understanding in emotion variable. It is rarely other things. It's usually these two. The reason why it usually is these two adalah despite us ever learning about motion part and despite us understand the variable in the debate, it is still very probable for us to not implement it. Understanding the theory and implementing that theory are two sides of the same. And that's why it's important to be able to know apakah you have implemented your understanding. Jadi these type of problem becomes caused by that. The depth of what you understand and what have you implemented. Jadi kayak in that specific concept and in that specific context, it's important to have a secondary opinion. If it is not from your own, then it needs to so either the theory in it or it comes from, let's say, a coach figure or a judge, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing that usually affects it is the understanding on the variable. Now, this often happens to a lot of young debater, especially karena banyak topik you might not understand yet. Jadi kayak ada specific type of topic that you find difficult. Let's say that in near future we will have PGTC. The topic is very specific, which is about Minerva, and it's not things that commonly discussed by everyone. So in that specific context, it's very easy and common for people to have a harder time to find burden than usual because they cannot figure out what the motion is about. Now, if that's the case, then what you might do, kalau misalnya masalahnya adalah di motion part, tadi bisa ya, kayak you can get second opinion during practice. If the issue is correlated to your overall understanding to a certain type of matter, the most easiest thing to resolve it adalah to get matter, which is to read more, which to be able to get better resources of matter as well. And that's why in the beginning I say these are never fixed in competition. These are like things that you can implement during your training. Jadi kayak that's what you can try to do, of course. Jadi bisa kayak gitu. That's the first thing. The second thing adalah what if this happened during competition and you don't have time to prepare it anymore? Then the best thing that you can do is to debate the motion as generic as you can. Because even if you don't understand the matter, there can be general induction that you could get from the motion. What do I mean by this? For example, kalau motionnya itu spesifik banget, misalnya tentang minerba, and then what you understand tentang kayak, let's say, coal industry, is it the specific fact that coal industry are, let's say, related to econ, right? Like that's something yang we can deduce. Coal related to econ. Related to econ berarti ada penjual belian. Kalau ada penjual belian, berarti ada consumer dan ada the people that are going to sell it. So it's just of imagining either that, it depends on how far can you imagine it, of course. Kalau cuma stop sampai situ, to the very least what you could be able to deduce adalah in certain type of motion about coal industry, at least you can create an argument kenapa certain type of consumer might be disbenefited, or like kenapa consumer in general will be disbenefited. Like that's the kind of assumption. Or let's say motion is about IR. Let's say that you are debating specifically about conflict in a countries you never even heard before. So what you can deduce adalah understanding we're talking about conflict. Conflict correlate to what? Kalau mau lebih sedikit spesifik, conflict is related to political choice. Misalnya kayak gitu. Tapi kalau mau lebih general karena nggak bisa dibisu political choice ya udah kayak conflict related to international relations. International relation is correlated to kayak misalnya country relationship. So if that's the case, then you talk about country relationship. How does certain type of decisions affect country relationship? Dan kayak gitu, hal yang lebih general IR conflict usually related to humanitarian concern. Humanitarian concern would manifest into, let's say, rights being taken. If that's the case, we talk about. Jadi kayak, try to think about what is the most general discussion you can take out of certain motion. Any worst case, I do not suggest this like as a strategy. This is something you can do, or you may want to do in context where you are in a competition, you're facing certain type of issue, you don't understand. So try to be able to find the common general ground as fast as you could within your teammates in order for you to be able to create burden and arguments out of it. Jadi paling enggak dia tuh terlalu karena topiknya yang begitu, tapi it's just that seberapa specific and deep and how specific how relevant your matter can be, that's the question. But like as long as you are generally relevant, I think that should still be enough in order for you to create a reasonably compelling case, right, within the news. Jadi kayak that's an example of what you can do kalau misalnya the issue are understanding an emotion variable that is correlated to inability to find and comprehend the matter. That's the second thing. Jess often says that my burden is unstrategic. Now, this is something that I like to say to people I judge, and I think that people often hear whenever that they debate a mission. Like sometimes they will say that, oh yeah, your case is good, your heart's, but I feel like it can be more strategic, the way that answer would be. Now, prosesnya dulu. Prosesnya pertama adalah you might bring something relevant, it's just that it is not immediately felt because there is a missing possibility in the process of proving the burden. How does it look like? This usually look like into kayak misalnya tadi in the example before, where you would like to talk about promotion of the radical campus. It's not wrong. It can be relevant. But because there is a missing step into getting that can generate that misunderstanding of like, kenapa ya? It's the most direct thing that come out of this motion, for example. So usually the lack of these missing possibilities generate burden that seems quote unquote or usually it creates a burden that seems far-fetched. There is an example in here. Emotion tadi di awal was supporting the portrayal of women as vengeful, supernatural entities in horror media. The biggest burden that government want to prove is what? There will be better overall validation with women's angles. Two, you want to be focuses in describing this validation, the importance of the validation, and how the validation contribute to better activism. Now, I want to ask the question, what is the mistake in government strategy? Sounds like a good enough case for me. Menurut kalian, apa yang membuat ini jadi tidak terlalu strategik? Ada yang bisa anyone? Oh, right? I will start asking name. Is it cello or cello? Do you want to try?
Oh, it's cello, Kak.
Okay. Do you want to try? What do you think? The strategic mistake?
Wait, Kak, could you please repeat the question?
Oh, the question adalah kenapa di strategi yang dilakuin sama government-nya, yang you can take a look in the screen, itu tuh can be considered as a strategic problem.
Wait, Kak, wait, I'm so sorry. I'm outside right now. Tapi tadi government-nya bilang apa ya?
Okay, I'll read it ya. Government-nya in motion yang tadi ya, tentang support the portrayal of women as vengeful supernatural entities in horror media. They say that satu, there will be better overall validation toward women's anger. Dan kedua, P1 sampai P3-nya focuses in describing this validation, the importance of the validation, and how the validation contribute to better activism for feminists.
Validation ya, I think it needs more gimana ya, apalagi kan from P1 until P3-nya it brings about validations kan. I think it's much more better kalau misalnya the P2 and also P3-nya tuh kayak talking about much more deeper explanation about that, how then the validation itu could lead toward their burden of proof-nya gitu sih, I think.
Any idea? Or kayak, you know that that's a strategy, but still need time untuk nge-format. Like for instance, things that might be.
Kayaknya kalau validation itu kurang kayak buat nge-proof their point ya. Kayak mereka bisa pakai kayak kalau mereka mau support tentang kayak gimana ya? Kalau misalnya mau ngebawa tentang kayak sesuai sama motionnya itu, I think they could try to brings kayak kayak woman empowerment or something like that di media perfilman kayak gitu.
Jadi, semua ke media perfilmannya, jelas sesuatu kayak visual good. I assume that's the case. Tadi Shafira raise hand. Do you want to raise? Yeah, Shalom. Do you want to add? Sorry.
Kayaknya mungkin mereka bisa bawa kayak misalnya kalau misalnya dari satunya kayaknya mereka bisa bawa kayak misalnya from like the gender equality in terms of like film itu kayaknya lebih ke arah kayak nggak dilimitasi gitu, like maksudnya kayak perempuan juga bisa kayak berperan in terms of like jadi kayak di horor-horor kayak begitu, so like technically maksudnya itu lebih ke arah kayak perempuan gitu juga bisa kayak bekerja di situ, so like literally there's no like limitation since that is actually what means by like woman apa ya kayak I think that's what I mean by woman empowerment. Maksud aku tuh kayaknya bukan begitu sih, maksudnya lebih ke arah kayak pemberdayaan perempuan di perfilman aja, jadi kayak mereka bisa act like supernatural entity gitu without really needs to be kayak di stigmatisasikan gitu.
Okay. Tapi kayak emang overall adalah directing it toward the environment of like supernatural entities. Shafira tadi resign, sorry. Do you have anything to add or like you want to ask?
Yeah, sorry. Tadi kayaknya kepencet doang sih. But I do have a question before you start this problem of identifying the burden in the chat. I typed it. Sorry if I interrupted.
That's okay. Oh yeah, ada. I'm going to get there as the third point ya. So we're going to go here dulu, and then I'm going to answer the additional questions. Nah, jadi so in a sense that I think that tadi Selo identify the correct missing part, which like this is not directly related to movies, meanwhile that we are talking about horror media. That is correct. However, tadi kayak similar mistake yang Selo did as the example adalah directly jump toward empowerment without necessarily explaining dulu kenapa portrayalnya itu tuh will manifest into empowerment. And that's the exact strategic mistake that come from the effort. Karena talking about better overall validation and talking about empowerment, it is a possible impact, balik lagi, that can come out of supporting the motions. The importance is also doing a good job in framing why this argument and case matter. Tapi it does not explain the plausibility of this being the direct impact of emotions. Specific karena motionnya tentang portrayal. Tadi kita balik ya, when we talk about support or oppose, we need to describe dulu bentuk portrayalnya gimana. How does it look like? And that will manifest into apakah benar kayak misalnya the way that the portrayal of women as potential supernatural entity itu tuh validated atau kayak ya the portrayal of women as potential supernatural entity itu tuh empower Like that's like the kind of thing that Kanon was saying. That's the first question that Kanon was saying in order to make the burden a lot more directly related to what emotion. Now, the absence of this explanation means that assumptionnya sounds less direct, which affected people's overall understanding to consider this a strategy. Jadi kayak I'm not saying that any of those is irrelevant. They are a relevant harm, they are a relevant impact. But the issue is that directly contributed because of emotion. And that is something that a lot of the debater often miss. And if you would like to be able to kind of like improve and increase your overall, kayak misalnya complexity of these that are much more directed, like much more contextual, because you might want to start to consider apakah your case itu tuh directly correlated with the type of motion. Is it strategically correct according to this type of motion, that type of. So that's the explanation to this specific type of questions. Now, I'm going to answer question in Canada. Shabira said that they are prone to false with your own assumption, whether they see a motion, how to see it objectively. You can add more clarification if I'm wrong, but as far as I can understand this question, is that a lot of the time you have a bias what like topics, and oftentimes you created a burden bit of that bias assumption, and then because it is created out of that bias assumption, kadang susah melihat a more objective perception on how to define emotion tadi. Right? That's like what I understand dulu. Kalau misalnya salah, feel free to bertanya. Tapi kayak if that's the case, I said there are a few things. First, let's understand dulu kenapa then we have that biases. That's normal, by the way, and that's exactly what people would do when they start the debate. As a person, as a human, we have this we already have our set of thoughts. And a lot of the time, especially when you started debate in your formative year, ketika kalian udah English, ketika kalian udah remaja akhir, dan ketika kalian berada di, let's say, dewasa awal, mungkin 20-an, 23, while that we do not really have everything figured out, we already have a set of identity. For example, as a 18 years old, I know I'm a progressive person. And in that regard, obviously, my worldview and the way that I perceive the type of case would be interpreted in a progressive framework. And these biases are not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that it can make it a lot difficult ketika biasnya specific or biasnya is too narrow. That make it a lot harder for us to be able to identify a more strategic person. So what now? The first thing that we can do adalah to try to expand the worldview. Again, this is a continuous project ya. Jadi kayak the first thing that you can try to do adalah ketika misalnya you debate, because you are unreliable untuk bisa nge-confirm apakah ini bias atau enggak, always have someone else untuk confirm. Apakah ini udah expansive, apakah ini objective enough in perceiving this, or like are you still like getting set into that perspective of biases. Coba latihan pakai motion yang biasanya kamu punya bias on. Jadi jangan motion yang general, motion to involve this type of biases. Jadi that would help you bisa kayak understand apakah kayak di feel consistently fall to that bias itself. Sama itu dulu. Jadi the first step adalah finding a method untuk kamu bisa get access untuk bisa identify kapan kamu bias dan enggak. Jadi kayak learning the pattern. Patternnya kapan kamu bias. Gimana biasanya bentuknya kalau kamu bias. Lalu setelah kamu identify the pattern, what you can do adalah try to expand it. Jadi setelah tahu nih, biasanya aku biasesnya adalah bentuknya kayak gini. Biasanya terjadi ketika di konteks kayak gini. What you can do adalah gimana caranya untuk meng-expand. Biasanya metodenya ada dua. Pertama, you try to absorb more different type of worldview. This look like into kayak engaging in conversation with people with different opinion dan tools biasanya. Jadi kayak red side kayak orang-orang yang dekatnya biasanya agak beda nih. The kind of case that they identify. Nah, this will allow you untuk bisa kayak lihat juga, oh ternyata kalau this type of person biasanya the right argumentnya kayak gini. Kalau that type of person biasanya the right argumentnya kayak gini. Atau what you can also do adalah try to confirm more opinion section from me. What I like to do untuk kayak expand my understanding on certain type of topic adalah biasanya tuh baca opinion section. Terutama karena it is contributed by a lot of people from different experience of life and from different type of background. Jadi it helps me to be able to have a much more expansive understanding of life, and that helps biasanya ke increases my understanding. I I expanded my thoughts and perspective through this session. Either that baca dari opinion section kita, atau bisa juga nonton video from different type of opinion. And there are a lot of resources that can review that right now. Or kalau misalnya lagi di lomba, hear your opponents. Karena the person yang bakalan opposite from you are probably either your teammates because they are different or your opponent. Jadi try to see what do they usually rebut, what do they identify, how do they say that you are net, how do they say that you are not expansive or objective. Jadi kayak try to take that as a consideration, and that is usually very very good because they would definitely be critical of your perspective. Jadi itu method of training yang bisa dilakukan. Kalau misalnya go with those specific kind of problemnya. Nah, itu latihan. Kalau untuk kayak jadi kehidupannya, karena you cannot come up with that on your own, biasanya it help untuk kayak pertama paling nggak tahu dulu kayaknya aku nggak bisa buat identitas yang bagus di motion ini, probably don't be first speaker, try to speak later. Jadi kayak it usually reduces the possibility of us making the debate too narrow, karena biasanya what you need to do adalah fight atau kayak disusun kasus your teammate. Misalnya your teammate yang ngebuat setupnya, what you do adalah create input out of that setup gitu, misalnya kayak gitu. Jadi it reduces the possibility and risk of you creating kayak set of burden yang terlalu um, contextualize to your apa itu can try to if you are in a competition. Jadi kalau di competition and you kayak gak yakin that you are able untuk expand the discussion better karena kayak feel like there's a certain biases, be a later speaker, kayak switch with your teammate yang lebih able untuk kayak take that objective status. That's what you can try to. I hope that's clear. Saya kira kita follow up question.
Yes, thank you. There's no follow-up questions.
Very much for the question. Next question we have from Kyla, which is I'm too confused with how in the region and how to share the wisdom with my teams. Ini berarti correctly ngomong, struggle-nya adalah in identify tadi ya, express and characterization of factor-nya. Terus gimana caranya, by sharing, do you mean kayak gimana caranya ngasih ke teammate-nya, kayak mana yang kamu bawa dan teammate-nya bawa, atau lebih ke kayak how to communicate it to your teammate? Which one is it? Before I answer. I will answer both, either way. Let's go with the first one dulu. Nah, maybe you can try to clarify more confusion on explaining burdennya gimana. But if it is method of delivery, biasanya for a more seasonal debater yang udah sering debat, they can have much more fluency in like introducing actor characterization through what they are framing and through what they are arguing. If you are newbie and if you are a novice debater, what you would want to habituate probably adalah try to create it in the beginning of your speeches. Jadi kayak before anything else, try to set up dulu. Before your argument, set up dulu. Actor interestnya apa? What is the priority of the stakeholder? Kalau misalnya in a soft actor, try to answer dulu the question, how would you define should and why did the actor should? Misalnya kayak gitu. If you would like to do it in your argument, try konteks dulu sebelum argument assertion, context before the issue of argument. Jadi contextualization-nya gimana bentuknya? Like, how would the characterization of actor look like? So if that's the issue with delivery, if the confusion comes from like explaining the burden specifically in the debate, then it needs to come from case building, bukan kayak dari delivery. Jadi during case building, I don't do case build, but what I like to do adalah biasanya I'll take 1-2 minutes in the beginning untuk kayak conceptualizing what I want to do. Jadi kayak I will identify things that I need to identify on, and then that is where I put kayak tulisan tentang burden dari actor ini tuh sejauh apa ya. Kayak misalnya, oh burdennya kita cukup ngejelasin tentang misalnya the most important aspeknya, and aspek the most important itu adalah tentang let's say interest atau kayak let's say motive. Jelasin kenapa motive is the most important. Jadi kayak if you would like to convince yourself that burdennya is the most important, you need to be able to explain it. Gak bisa cuma kayak ascertain that, okay, the burden are okay, tapi kenapa? Like the why, right? So I guess that's what you can do kalau misalnya confusionnya adalah the experience burden. Jadi jangan cuma isi dari interestnya, tapi kenapa that's a specific interest you pick and select. Jadi that's going to help biasanya. So kayak nge-convince people kalau ini tuh important. That's on the internal process on you as a person and as a developer. Next is how do you share that? There are several methods that you could try to do in sharing this. The first thing that definitely you can try to do adalah depending on the questions yang you made, of course. Tapi kayak start with dulu understanding tentang teammate kesulitan understand di bagian apa itu dulu kalau misalnya ada confusion. Tapi kalau nggak ada confusion, if you're first speaker kasih tahu aja kayak by the way kita tuh anak advocate yang akan kita bilang ini ya alasannya kenapa. Jadi kayak as we would do in your speech, jangan lupa untuk convey kenapanya biar mereka ngerti. Jadi kasih tahu dulu karakterisasi interestnya, baru kenapanya ke your teammate. That's what you can do. Nanti divide-nya gimana? Nggak usah di-divide banget gimana sih? Karena at the end of the day kan semua argumennya bakalan related to that burden, right? It will correlate to that burden. Jadi kayak either way, just ingetin aja kalau mau ngomongin impact, correlate lagi kenapa dia berhubungan dengan burden dari atas. So I guess that's what you can try to explain to your teammate kalau misalnya ngomongin tentang tadi how can you communicate that. That's an example. I hope it's clear. Kyle, is it clear? Do you have one follow-up question? Follow-up question. Can we charge my follow-up here? Okay, next question is from Zafira. How do I fulfill both of principle and practical burdens and missions, especially in practicality? Should I throw both away? Okay. Now this will go into a session of how to make a plausible of analysis, right? It goes to an analysis section, which would take more time and develop. Tapi kayak the TLDR version, which is the short version of what can we understand adalah there is no such thing as like fulfilling practical and principle burden. What I'd like everybody to understand adalah most of the time both need to be proven. Bedanya adalah what we understand about principle is usually philosophical, but that is not true. Concept of an argument is principle. So in an argument, you do not want to only have practical aspects. You don't want to just talk about benefit, but you're probably going to conceptualize the benefit first, right? So you have to talk about the justification of it, the importance of it, and that's why in an argument, most of the time, the two component exist. Concept of the argument. What is the theoretical graph? What is the characterization that are last manifested? And then the practical aspect, which is always manifestation of the time. Now, in that specific circumstances, what you can do adalah either you can have more logical chains of reasoning untuk bisa mengfulfill it, atau you can try to be able to take a lot of ways to create analysis. Portrayal help to cement bentuk konsepnya apa, bentuk praktikalnya apa. So it help you, but it is not the only way for you to be able to fulfill this specific burden. Jadi kayak it's not the only way, tapi it can help. Kapan it help you? Depend on the motion. There are motion yang kayak sangat arbitrary karena kayak terlalu kompleks, jadi require more portrayal. For example, in debate yang tentang tadi, yang tentang portrayal of women-nya, probably portrayal is not necessarily the most solid thing to do because like I don't think it's a bit hard untuk understand portrayal of horror-nya gimana. Jadi kayak maybe portrayal is not the most thick argumentnya, but like maybe a more thicker argument would be but evaluating and analyzing the portrayal itself, for example. Or sometimes when you have like let's say multiple portrayals in an argument yang tentang kayak philosophical banget, debate tentang naratif, portrayal help because without portrayal it's a bit hard for us to be able to imagine how certain type of narrative look like, how would a trend look like. Jadi kayak that's another example ya. Jadi kayak basically it depends. The answer is 3. It depends. The second thing is that it can work, but also depends. Or the third thing is that at the end of the day, it goes back to what is the most important questions that you need to answer, and then selecting which analysis to accompany that specific type of argument in order for it to be answered much better. Jadi kayak gitu. That's the answer for Hayla. I hope that's clear. Let me know if you have follow up. Selo asks question. I usually kind of struggle and confused to choose the right burden for flow of emotions. Do you have example of emotion? I will answer this kind of later setelah nanti waktu kita untuk selection. Tapi kayak drop the motion example, so it would be a lot easier for me untuk picturize philosophy motion yang kayak gimana. Okay, so we will continue dulu. I'm still collecting questions, jadi don't worry. Tapi kayak for now, answer, try to drop it dulu aja nanti I'll answer ya. Just to make sure that we cover all the session. Yes. Nah, the next thing. Judge often said that my burden is on strategic oriented. Kalau ini tadi ngejawab juga banyak tentang bias. Here's the thing. Kenapa ini akhirnya agak dekat di Indonesia? Kita tentunya bias to output. When we see motions, really what the motion implication is, which is not bad. Tapi kayak we directly jump into assuming the output before correlating it with emotion. And makanya kita kadang pikirin langsung nih kayak tentang apa nih bentuk empowerment-nya langsung. Kayak kita mau ngomongin validation, itu kan output based banget ya. Nah, kalau bias yang nggak ke output, ada orang-orang juga yang punya bias specific variable. Biasanya we have to set to certain word promotion and progress. Misalnya kayak kita fokus banget ke wording tentang horror media, we don't think about other part of the movie. Nah, that's like another conversation. Ini reasoning kenapa kita sometimes keep the process, keep the identification to what is the question and need to answer. Dan jadi kayak just because background kenapa this something happen. What are these and strategic burden itu? Okay, to add more one is understanding tools. Repeat. Next, we're going to go with supply. Nah, step by step. Let's start with macro, major and then burden. There are three things that you do. The first thing adalah lihat motion type. The second thing is to read the variable carefully and dissect it. Never assume. Jadi kayak coba lihat variable motion-nya apa aja and try to dissect what this mean in the details. It's like ini proses yang agak lama kalau di case building, tapi waktu latihan worth it karena what you are trying to do is basically to have with faster dissection process. And then strategize the most important question that you need to answer. Nah, let's go to example. Without that, the commercialization of paganism variabelnya tiga. Sama motion tadi, without that. Analysis debate, evaluate. The first variable is commercialization of paganism, which can be dissected to concept of commercialization, concept of paganism. What do you understand about commercialization? What do you understand about paganism? And then there is word of brings more harm than. Berarti you need to identify the specific part and you need to compare it to the good. Kenapa the harm itu? That's how you read it, right? So that is building process. Okay, motion part is what? Variable is what does the variable mean? And then what is implication of it? Jadi kayak motion part is tulisan. Implicationnya evaluate. Okay, I need to make, let's say, way from bad versus good. The variable is commercialization of paganism. First, there is commercialization and paganism. Meaning that I need to interpret what does commercialization and paganism usually look like and how are they what. Misalnya, let's talk about commercialization in itself. Look like what? Kenapa it's bad? Paganism looks like what? Kenapa it is important to discuss and how does they affect people? So commercialization of paganism as a whole variable looks like what and what does it mean? And next, bring harm this word. Okay, I need to understand what does the harm look like? What does the good look like? How it's a harm? Or should we prioritize the harm and not the good? So that's like the way that you can interpret. Obviously, it's not simple karena motionnya nggak punya banyak variable. Tapi at the end of the day, usually the process is the same. It's about how you can use the motion, read each variable and dissect it, and strategize, interpret. Tadi interpretation, therefore after interpreting it, you come to the questions. Kalau gitu, debat ini adalah debat evaluatif tentang commercialization of paganism that aim to be able to explain why the harm is a lot more, let's say, than the benefit. So, in that context, what you probably want to answer adalah why commercialization of paganism has more negative effect than positive. To make it more specific, you're probably going to dissect that into nanti the micro. Makronya kan itu dulu. That's a macro. That's the most important question, basically to answer that specific burden. Nah, to go to the micro in the same questions as well, you're probably going to see dulu questions yang importantnya apa, and create multiple coherent questions. You strategize placement and structure it in a way that you'd like to answer them, and then insert your analysis and check its completeness. This look like, tadi pertanyaan yang mau dijawab adalah, even government wants to reflect on the way that it affects paganism as a spiritual being. Jadi pertama, dia ngomongin tentang harm. Harm yang mau dibawa adalah it affects paganism as a spiritual belief. That's what they want to talk about. Now, in doing that, what would probably be the strategy from the government in creating an identified religion? Adalah pertama, okay, kita mau bahas ini sebagai spiritual belief. Berarti we need to know dulu, what does paganism represent sebagai spiritual belief? What is its importance? Importance dari paganism itu apa? Ke siapa? How would commercialization affect this as a spiritual belief? How does the commercialization even look like? What is the effect harmful? How does it weigh against the most probable benefit? Which is like, oh, as a spiritual belief, it encourages popularization of it. That's probably the assumption from your position. Nah, you see that the example, ini expansion of question ya. Tadi kan ada beberapa, when we are talking about it, you're probably going to try to expand them. You're probably going to dissect them. You're going to probably create like an analysis out of like the burden. Tapi expansion look like that. You list down every possible relevant questions out of your main question and then strategize it. Berarti ini udah aku susun btw. So I already susun what I want to talk about. First I will talk about paganism. In a speech, it would look like that. I would like to answer the way that paganism reflects the spiritual identity of the community that practices, and I would like to answer why this is that. This is the most important part because the specific type of harm that need to be discussed in the debate always have to reflect what the people that care so much about the spiritual belief, and that is not general society, but the people that actually practice paganism. Now, let's understand first what does paganism look like and how does it how it is being represented what this community spiritual beliefs. Ya gitu kan. Now, that's like the order of the way that I will answer that. And then I will create an analysis out of that question. Jadi kayak I know that what does paganism represent. I'll try to create a set of list of analysis. Misalnya, oh, it represents identity. It represents sanctity. Or it represents what? What is it? Whatever it is that I would like to broaden the debate, I'm going to conceptualize. And that's like the way that you are expanding the burden. And that's how you organize the burden. That's how you identify the analysis. Organizing need to make sense. Makanya wordingnya coherent. Jadi kayak you might be able to identify the expansion, tapi belum tentu dirapihin. Makanya latihan teks sama berarti latihannya adalah identifying major. Setelah identifying major, what you would like to practice adalah gimana ngembangin burden. Setelah ngembangin burdennya, you might want to pay on how to organize that burden. How do you choose to say A before B, right? Setelah itu baru isinya, right? So a lot of the time, we have to fix it on piece before we are able untuk kayak even identify the question or organize the question. Jadi step by step kayak that's like probably my suggestion for your training and identifying burden and how can you create a much more strategic minor or like let's say micro burden in a debate that can complete your macro burden. Jadi kan that's all the manifestation. Nah, the last section I believe in this section is that what if there are long context lines? There are long context lines, multiple pages. Let's say 2 pages context line with paragraph. Step by stepnya sama. However, you need to comprehend context like this means the first thing that you need to you need to be able to dissect the context and you need to list down the conclusion and see how it affects the overall understanding of the emotion. Karena kayak the mistake that often happens adalah we sometimes forgotten that the context like this. That the context like is your general truth, and oftentimes that means that whatever argument that is out of that context like it's not the motion, sorry, did not reflect this context. That's like the unstrategic position that oftentimes happens. Now, there is an example here, which is on restorative justice. It's very long. I will read it in. Restorative justice prefer a legal approach that centers the restoration of relationships and of harms caused by an offense, prioritizing reconciliation between offender, victims, and communities, and reintegration of the offenders over future consequences. The second, in its adoption, Indonesia draws concept of resolution from Pancasila and local customs, which are centered on communal harmony and relationship behavior as the primary goal of dispute resolution. Indonesia currently applies restorative justice in a limited capacity, restricted to minor offenses, e.g., petty theft, minor assault, and traffic accidents. Motion. This also believes that the wider adoption and scope expansion of restorative justice is within the interest of American society. This is very overwhelming because not only that the motions are hard, but some we feel like I don't have time. I don't have time to that. The first thing that we need to do adalah understanding people by itself. Pertama baca lagi. What do we understand about restorative justice? Interpret it. Always try to interpret it, don't just read it. Yang bisa kita understand adalah restorative justice itu adalah legal approach. The second thing we can understand adalah fokusnya restoration relationship and community harm. Nah, berarti perlu kita interpret adalah kayak gimana ini, like restoration of relationship. Apakah itu berarti orangnya harus get along? Apakah harus ada but how does it look like, right? Terus kedua, prioritization conciliation. Benar nih, berarti harus ada perbaikan hubungan. Karena kayak restoration of relationship, on top of that ada reconciliation between offender victim and community. Okay, berarti ada perbaikan hubungan in one way or another. Maybe worst case assumption-nya adalah perbaikan hubungan langsung. Yang enggak worst case, best case assumption-nya adalah perbaikan hubungan as in integration kalian. And that is the next thing. It's like integration, right? So that's like the interpretation. Interpretation-nya adalah berarti restorative justice adalah legal approach yang dipakai untuk memperbaiki hubungan orang-orang dengan korban dan juga orang-orang yang sedang menjadi korban secara umum karakteristiknya atau komunitas agar mereka bisa terintegrasi balik ke masyarakat. Like that's the interpretation of the first context. And do the same thing with the second one. What do you understand out of it? Nah, after you understand the concept, what you can do is to do the same thing. See the motion time. Okay, Jesus believe that the wider adoption is scope expansion. Berarti we need to be able to understand nih parameter of wider adoption and scope expansion gimana, right? So, how does it look like? Di sini katanya kayak currently it's limited, berarti it's expanded. Terus kayak restorative justice within interest of Indonesian society. Tadi kita bilang ya tentang perbaikan hubungan. How can you understand the Indonesian society part? Take a look at the context slide yang kedua atau interpret it. Menurut kalian Indonesian society itu gimana? Hubungan-hubungan seperti apa yang biasanya tidak kena restorative justice. Tadi katanya limited. Berarti kayak untuk yang tidak terkena restorative justice sekarang, kita mau buat restorative justice. Kenapa? Like in what way does it? Like berarti we need to think about things that are more general. But how specific? The specific things that we might want to directly jump into adalah murder. Murder is not general. Because that is not a common problem that average Indonesian society face. Maybe it's an interest, tapi nggak interest of Indonesian society. It's an interest of specific Indonesian society. So what is the more often thing that Indonesian society do? Yang biasanya unique. Let's say that radical protest. Like that's something yang oftentimes a lot of people see for. Like more majoritarians. Or kalau nggak radical protest, maybe sesimpel kayak perbuatan kriminal yang tidak merugikan individu. Let's say mencuri dari organisasi yang punya uang. That's also another thing that you do. Like that with an instance. So if you don't really understand like the concept of majority, assume the most vulnerable. Don't assume the least vulnerable. Assume the most vulnerable. Kalau kesulitan untuk understand the general perceptions, assume the most vulnerable because at least that would help your argument to sound more skillful. Like in the debate. Obviously, that might not be the most strategic. That's like a better case rather than hyper-fixating on a case yang susah di-defend karena let's say it's a lot harder to defend murder. It's a lot harder to defend things that are very, very evil in intent. Let's say the sexual harassment. Right? So that's like what you can do. Kalau misalnya you're facing wrong context. I will try to see. Okay. Nah, jadi itu overall on how you identify. Nah, I'm going to fix the slide The slide masih ada some part of my previous. This is like a PPT I use for it for self esteem seminar today. Jadi kayak ada beberapa slide yang belum hilang. Gue itu hilangin dulu before I share it juga sebentar. But let's go with Q&A ya. Tadi ada satu pertanyaan yang belum aku jawab, and then there are more questions as well. Feel free to drop in the questions. Tadi yang pertama yang belum aku jawab adalah tentang Michelle. Struggle and confused to choose the right word. That's for philosophy motion. Do you have like example on the philosophy motion? Uh, do you have example? Karena a bit hard untuk picturize kayak contohnya susah. Is it philosophy by nature atau philosophy as in that? Wah, ini tuh kayak debat tentang, let's say, yang memang filosofi nih, kayak ngomongin tentang virtue ethic misalnya. Atau kayak ngomongin tentang konsep of hedonism. Which is it? In the meantime, while waiting for this book, just like answer question is a series of steps. I'm still confused on how do we make a beauty that is not too heavy, but not too shallow. Because often I choose a very heavy beauty and end up not answering the beauty. Heavy beauty often happens because of two reasons. First of all, the lack of understanding of like what is realistic within the context of debate. Karena ada terjadi ketika we don't really have like good grasp or knowledge of what this context even requires. Jadi sometimes in let's say humanitarian type of mission, we create a beauty that is hard to answer misalnya resolving. Meanwhile, conflict is so hard to resolve. Or kayak misalnya di debat tentang movement, creating changes. Creating changes is very hard. It's very manual, right? Now, that's because there is like absence of understanding to the specific context that the motion operates on. Jadi that's the first reason. The second reason yang create problem with like choosing very heavy heavy type of burden. As well as usually also have karena kayak misalnya we don't really have a good grasp of understanding apakah ini tuh udah on par with the setup. Jadi kayak pertama, what is realistic within context? Kedua, what is realistic within our setup? Jadi kayak pertama itu berarti you need to reflect apakah the setup and the burden itu tuh sesuai, matching. For example, if you don't really have setup untuk menjawab kenapa konflik yang bakalan resolve, probably that's too big of a burden. Or kayak setup yang bisa menjawab tentang equality, that probably is too big of a burden. So what do you do then to make sure that it's small, tapi not shallow and not too generous? Now, the most important thing when it comes to burden adalah how contextualized can be to what you move. Jadi balik lagi, the way that you can apakah itu realistic and at the same time still is like transient to your debate adalah apakah that fulfill the specific type of context where the motion operate on. Jadi variable motion ya Pak. Nah, for example of this adalah, let's say in a motion it's a lot harder for you to probably talk about, let's say, equality. But it's not easier if you could be able to talk about things that it get you closer to specific type of benefits. Misalnya adalah ngomongin tentang wage gap. And then you want to say that, oh, we could be able to equalize wage gap. That's the thing. Tapi I understand that you're talking about context of, let's say, advocating for a better position over kayak misalnya reformation of equal wage gap. Jadi kayak kita udah ngeganti standard wage gapnya, one adalah encouraging person to get to higher position, so ultimately they will get better payment. Let's say that. So, and the second step is the advocacy. Within the context of that advocacy, what you could be able to realistically do adalah to be able to visibly give like method yang lebih accessible for women to do. Misalnya kayak gitu. Jadi kayak which method that is much more accessible for women, that is like contextualized, it's not shallow, but still something yang realistically can be done within the debate. But on the other hand, kalau kita more reflected on, let's say, the setup, let's say the setup, you talk about the advocacy as in that you're probably going to always aggressively aim for promotion. You're going to probably try to advocate for kayak misalnya more changes in policy to allow more women in managerial position. then realistically, you might want to say that we might not be able to reform the law overnight, we might be able to guarantee women's access to kayak misalnya being able to be promoted, tapi at least what we are able to get adalah a much more better kayak misalnya impact if it is manifested. Jadi kayak you might not promise the impact, but like if we do get the impact, you will be able to get a better impact out of kayak daripada di opposition. Misalnya kayak gitu. That's like the assumption you might want to bring. Jadi kayak that require untuk ngejelasin juga kalau misalnya, oh by the way kalau mau ngomongin changes that's a little bit hard and that's what we need to probably focus on. Kayak apakah overall impactnya if it is manifested could be better. Misalnya that's what you're trying to do. Nah, that's an example ya on how can you directly identify kayak apakah things are realistic and how can you identify that itu lebih narrow atau enggak. Hopefully that answer the questions. Nah, that's for Cecilia. If there is more questions, do drop. Next is hello about this house would abolish gender. Is that also emotion in tentang trans activists? Or is it not? Just generally kita mau ambil like does us prefer a world without gender? Which one? I assume both. Let's just like talk about both. Let's say that motion is about this was prefer a world with no concept of gender. Your question is, nah, I guess that, correct me if I'm wrong, the difficulty to identify it adalah karena you don't know the concept per se. Like, it's a bit hard because you cannot identify the philosophical concept within the debate and like the general assumption on the world, kalau misalnya kayak gitu kan. Nah, that means that problemnya balik lagi kepada your overall understanding to variables, like yang tadi kita masuk ke sana. Berarti you can try to either read more about it atau kayak you can try to be able to kayak see more perspective regarding to that to expand your understanding on the concept. Tapi kayak specifically on philosophy, it's a bit hard because biasanya it's like not something everybody can imagine. Because sometimes we tend to be a practical person, which is we are not raised philosophically. And as a practical person, imagining something too philosophical is a bit a drag and like a bit hard. So what I suggest you to do adalah number one, try to be able untuk kayak collect as many philosophical things you can do and try to be able to visualize ini tuh bentuknya gimana. Jadi kayak learning on visualization, learning making description on philosophical concept. Virtuatic bentuknya gimana ya kalau diajak sama orang. World with no gender tuh gimana ya kalau misalnya ke manifest. Jadi that's the first thing you can do in overall increasing your understanding to the philosophical concept. Karena method of creating burden sama. It's just that the differences in your understanding. So I guess that's the major thing that I would like to suggest you. The second thing that you can try to do as well adalah kalau bukan belajar untuk create visualization, try to be able itu kayak misalnya find a different alternative untuk kayak the right interpretation. The right interpretation bukan dalam visualization, tapi kayak your overall understanding logically ini maksudnya apa. Jadi kayak try to interpret it as lively as possible. Jadi semanusia mungkin. Kadang kalau udah try discussion and philosophy can solve out of this world. Jadi kayak try to make it as grassroots. That's what I like to do. Jadi kayak basically kalau kayak konsep no gender, it's the most common interpretation adalah people all will be non-binary. Or like people all will be agender. Like that's like if you cannot imagine the concept, then imagine the opposite of that concept. Maybe that would help untuk tahu. Atau kayak the world where people adopt virtue ethics, then comparatifnya adalah right now people berarti punya multiple ethics. Like so, what does it mean to only have one ethic? Jadi kayak that avoiding the discussion on interpreting the virtue ethics per se, but that helps bisa ngebuat things for grounded. So it's much more easier for you to do practically if you have all the time untuk imagining the philosophical ground. Voice of experience. That's what you can do to solve with that situation. Hope that answers most content. Is there any other questions? I would like to take it more. Pertama karena we still have 4 minutes overall. Let me check dulu apakah ada titipan dari Errol ya. 2 menit. See if there's titipan. There is no Tiffan selain foto, like microphone there. Is there any questions? Uh, it's always nice to have a lot of WGM to and meet more WGM, you know. So I'm definitely in a good mood. Thank you so much, guys, for participating in today's session. I hope that it helps. In any case, kalau misalnya ada kebingungan, if you have like questions overall about the session or outside of the session, if you have my number or if you have a way to contact me, feel free to do that. I am the most fast respond person. I will not lie. So it might take time for me to respond, but even if it takes time, I will try to respond. Jadi kayak gitu. That's what I'd like to do. Jadi kayak feel free to reach out with this question. Feel free to reach out on general group as well. I definitely am in forum. Jadi kalau kalian nanya di forum, I will definitely answer juga. Either way. Before we end the session, can I ask everyone to open their camera? Ada titipan foto bersama. I will end the session recording. Can I have everyone to open the cams? Yang konten aja.